When Carlo Gambino died on October 15, 1976, he died in his bed. He was 74 years old, at home in Massapequa, New York, of a heart attack. He had led the most powerful organized crime family in the United States for nearly 2 decades. He had survived the murder of his predecessor, a Senate investigation, multiple FBI surveillance operations, and the internal political pressures of an organization in which violent death was the most common form of career transition at the top. He had never been convicted of a serious felony in the United States. He had never served a significant prison sentence. He died as he had lived, quietly, invisibly, and in complete control. His name had inspired Mario Puzo's character of Vito Corleone. The FBI called him the most powerful underworld figure in the nation. What the federal surveillance files and documented investigative records show about who Carlo Gambino actually was is more patient, more structurally sophisticated, and more deliberately invisible than any fictional portrayal has ever captured. If you know Carlo Gambino, you probably know him as the inspiration for The Godfather. That connection is documented. Puzo acknowledged the influence, and the physical and operational resemblances between the fictional Corleone and the documented Gambino are specific enough that the connection was recognized immediately upon the novel's publication in 1969. But the fictional version and the documented version diverge in one critical way. Vito Corleone is presented as a man of honor, a man who valued family, who avoided unnecessary violence, who operated by a personal code that set him apart from lesser men. The documented Carlo Gambino was something more useful and more dangerous than a man of honor. He was a man of structure. What the FBI files show is not a patriarch dispensing wisdom from a darkened study. They show a precise organizational administrator who understood, more clearly than any of his contemporaries, that the greatest threat to a criminal organization was not law enforcement. It was visibility. He spent 30 years making himself invisible. It worked. This is what the documented record shows. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24, 1902, in Palermo, Sicily. He came from a family with documented connections to the Sicilian Mafia. His cousins, the Castellano family, were connected to the same criminal networks that would follow the wave of Sicilian immigration to the United States in the early 20th century. Gambino emigrated to the United States in 1921, at the age of 19, documented as arriving as a stowaway on the steamship Vincenza, landing in Norfolk, Virginia. He was not a legal immigrant. He would live and operate in the United States for over 50 years without ever becoming a naturalized citizen, a documented fact that federal authorities would attempt, unsuccessfully, to use against him in deportation proceedings in the 1970s. He settled in Brooklyn, in the Sheepshead Bay neighborhood, and almost immediately connected with the Mafia networks that were already established in the Italian-American immigrant communities of New York. By the mid-1920s, he was a documented associate of the Mangano crime family, the organization that would, through a series of murders and power transitions over the following 3 decades, become the Gambino family. During Prohibition, Gambino ran bootlegging operations documented in federal records as part of the larger network controlled by the Mangano family under Vincent and Philip Mangano. What the documented record consistently shows about Gambino's operational style, even at this early stage, is the characteristic that would define his entire career. He was an earner, not a showman. While other mob figures cultivated press attention, held court in public restaurants, and built personal reputations that made them targets for both law enforcement and internal rivals, Gambino operated quietly. He generated revenue. He avoided confrontation. He waited. In 1931, during the reorganization of American organized crime following the murders of Masseria and Maranzano that Lucky Luciano engineered, Gambino was formally inducted into the Cosa Nostra as a made member of the Mangano family. He was 29 years old. Over the following 2 decades, he built his position within the family through a combination of consistent revenue generation, documented loyalty to the family's leadership, and the cultivation of relationships across multiple New York families. Relationships built not through spectacle, but through quiet, consistent reliability. The murder that transformed Carlo Gambino's position within New York organized crime occurred in April 1951. Vincent Mangano, the boss of the family Gambino had served for over 2 decades, disappeared on April 19, 1951. His brother Philip was found shot dead the same day. The documented record shows that Albert Anastasia, the family's underboss, immediately claimed leadership, arguing to the commission that the Manganos had been planning to kill him first and that he had acted in self-defense. The commission accepted the argument. Anastasia became boss. What the documented record also shows, confirmed in multiple subsequent federal investigations and cooperating witness accounts, is that Gambino had aligned himself with Anastasia and supported the transition. The relationship between Anastasia and Gambino was, by documented accounts, close. Anastasia valued Gambino's organizational reliability and financial acumen, but the relationship concealed a documented divergence in operational philosophy. Anastasia was volatile, violent, and expensive in ways that created problems for the commission and for the family's earnings. Gambino was the opposite. By the mid-1950s, the documented record shows that Gambino had established a quiet alliance with Vito Genovese, the most ambitious boss in New York at the time, built on a shared understanding that Anastasia's leadership was organizationally unsustainable. On October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia was shot dead in the barber chair of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. The killing was precise and professional. Two gunmen entered the shop, forced the barber away, and shot Anastasia multiple times. No one was ever prosecuted. The documented evidence, confirmed across multiple cooperating witness accounts over the following decades, consistently identified the operation as having been approved by Vito Genovese and facilitated by Carlo Gambino. Within days of the murder, Gambino had positioned himself as the new boss of the family. He was 55 years old. He would lead it for the next 19 years. What he did with those 19 years is documented in extraordinary detail across FBI surveillance files, Senate testimony, and federal investigative records, and it constitutes the most successful sustained run of mob leadership in American history by any documented measure. The organizational philosophy that Gambino applied to the family that now bore his name was, at its core, a philosophy of deliberate invisibility at the top, combined with systematic revenue generation at every level below it. The documented FBI surveillance files from the 1960s show a boss who met with subordinates rarely, in locations that rotated constantly, and who communicated through intermediaries with a discipline that federal agents described in multiple internal reports as the most effective counterintelligence operation they had encountered in organized crime. Gambino never used telephones for sensitive discussions, a discipline documented as early as the 1950s, decades before law enforcement's electronic surveillance capabilities made such caution standard practice among mob leadership. He conducted sensitive meetings outdoors, walking through neighborhoods, a practice documented in FBI surveillance logs that show agents repeatedly losing him in the streets of Brooklyn and Howard Beach. He never frequented the social clubs and restaurants that served as operational headquarters for other family bosses, the same venues that FBI surveillance teams had successfully wired to document the activities of his contemporaries. The revenue streams that Gambino's organization generated during his leadership are documented across multiple federal investigations and congressional hearings. The construction industry in New York was documented as operating under Gambino family control through a network of union officials, contractors, and labor delegates who answered to family capos. The document tribute payments flowing from construction industry corruption were estimated by a 1969 federal grand jury investigation at over $20 million annually. Garbage collection and waste disposal in New York and New Jersey were documented as Gambino family territories, a revenue stream that federal investigators in the 1970s estimated at tens of millions of dollars annually, and that would remain a documented organized crime stronghold for decades after Gambino's death. Loan sharking operations were documented across every New York borough, generating revenues documented in federal financial investigations as consistent and substantial. And the garment district, the heart of New York's clothing manufacturing industry, was documented as a Gambino family revenue source through labor racketeering that controlled trucking, production schedules, and union contracts across dozens of manufacturers. The Appalachian Meeting of November 14, 1957, a documented gathering of over 60 mob bosses from across the United States at the Appalachian New York estate of Joseph Barbara was the single event that most significantly exposed Gambino to federal attention during his leadership. State troopers stumbled onto the gathering and documented the presence of organized crime figures from over a dozen states. Gambino was among those documented as present. The Senate investigation that followed, the McClellan Committee hearings, which produced the first significant public documentation of the commission's structure and the scope of American organized crime, generated FBI investigative resources directed at Gambino's organization that had not previously existed at that scale. Gambino's response to this increased scrutiny was characteristic. He became more invisible. The documented FBI surveillance files from the early 1960s show a boss who had reduced public exposure to near zero, who communicated through layers of intermediaries, and who continued to generate organizational revenue while presenting investigators with almost no prosecutable direct evidence. The most significant documented act of organizational manipulation that Gambino carried out in his final years was the management of the succession question. Paul Castellano, Gambino's cousin by marriage, a man whose organizational style resembled Gambino's own preference for quiet, business-focused criminal enterprise, was the documented choice. Gambino made that choice known in the final years of his life, in documented conversations with family leadership. When he died in October 1976, Castellano took over, bypassing Aniello Della Croce, the family's underboss, who had the support of a significant faction of the family's street-level members, including a Queens crew led by a rising earner named John Gotti. The documented resentment that succession decision produced. Gotti's crew believed Della Croce, not Castellano, had earned the position, would take nearly a decade to explode. But the explosion, when it came in December 1985, outside Sparks Steakhouse, was the direct consequence of the succession that Gambino had arranged. Even in death, the organizational decisions Gambino made shaped the family's trajectory for a decade after him. The federal government's attempts to prosecute Gambino during his lifetime are documented as a series of procedural near-misses that underline the effectiveness of his operational security. He was arrested in connection with a counterfeiting operation in 1937 and received a suspended sentence. He was identified at the Appalachian meeting and subpoenaed by the McClellan Committee, but invoked the Fifth Amendment and was not prosecuted. In 1970, federal authorities initiated deportation proceedings against him on the grounds that he had entered the country illegally in 1921, 50 years earlier. Gambino's attorneys successfully delayed the proceedings on medical grounds, citing heart disease. The deportation case was never resolved before his death. In over 50 years of documented FBI attention, Carlo Gambino was never convicted of a serious felony in the United States. He died of a heart attack in his own bed, surrounded by his family. He was the most powerful organized crime boss in American history by any documented measure of organizational reach and revenue, and he died as a free man. What the documented record shows about Carlo Gambino is this: he did not lead through fear alone, though fear was always available to him. He did not lead through spectacle, though his position commanded the most powerful criminal organization in the country. He led through structure, through a documented understanding that the survival of a criminal organization depended on the same things that guaranteed the survival of any organization: consistent revenue, defined hierarchy, reliable succession, and the discipline to remain invisible to the forces that wanted to destroy it. The FBI spent decades trying to build a case that would convict him. They never succeeded. The fictional Godfather that his life inspired became one of the most celebrated characters in American film history. The real Carlo Gambino remained, almost to the end, a name in an FBI file, documented everywhere, prosecuted nowhere. That is what the documented record shows about Carlo Gambino. Make of it what you will. If this is the kind of documented real history you want every week, subscribe to Mob Legacy. New boss biography every Wednesday. New mob countdown every Saturday.